every crime is a wound on the world. We're here to dissect it, layer by layer, to find the truth buried within. This is Anatomy of Crime. The darkness on Chappaquiddick Island is a profound and ancient thing. On the night of July 18, 1969, with a sliver of a moon hidden by clouds, that darkness was almost absolute. It pressed in on the narrow, unpaved roads, swallowed the scrub pines and tangled brush, and merged seamlessly with the black, brackish water of the tidal ponds. It was a darkness that muffled sound, distorted distance, and could easily erase a mistake, or a crime. The entire nation was still basking in the ethereal glow of history being made. Just 2 days away from watching men walk on the moon, it was a moment of boundless optimism, of reaching for the heavens. But on that small, isolated spit of land off Martha's Vineyard, a very different, far more terrestrial drama was about to unfold. One that would pull a name synonymous with aspiration and destiny down into the mud and the mire. Sometime around 11:15 that night, that very darkness was shattered by the splintering of wood and the violent rush of water, as a black 1967 Oldsmobile Dalemont 88 sedan failed to navigate a sharp turn, launched off the side of a low wooden bridge, and landed upside down in the murky depths of Pucha Pond. Inside the car were 2 people. The driver was the 37-year-old United States Senator from Massachusetts, Edward M. Kennedy. He was the last surviving son of a political dynasty, the reluctant heir to a legacy of power and tragedy that had become modern American mythology. His passenger was 28-year-old Mary Jo Kopechne, a bright, dedicated political strategist, one of the fiercely loyal women who had poured her heart and soul into the ill-fated presidential campaign of Ted's brother, Robert. Just a year before, within minutes, the senator would be free of the submerged vehicle, standing on the bank of the pond, gasping for air. Soaked and disoriented, Mary Jo Kopechne would not. She would remain trapped inside the car, in a rapidly shrinking pocket of air. As the cold, salt water slowly rose around her, she would die there, alone, in the crushing, silent blackness. But the real mystery of Chappaquiddick, the element that has haunted investigators, journalists, and the American public for over half a century, is not what happened in the seconds the car was in the air. It's what happened in the minutes, and then the agonizingly long hours that followed. Because after emerging from the water, Senator Ted Kennedy, a man trained in the law and sworn to uphold it, did not run to the nearest house to call for help. He did not alert the authorities. He did not raise a single alarm that could have dispatched a rescue team to the Dyke Bridge. Instead, for nearly 10 hours he said nothing. An abyss of silence. It is within that silence that the truth of the night was lost. A period of time that allowed for shock to curdle into calculation, and for a straightforward tragedy to metastasize into an enduring national scandal. Tonight we are not just examining a fatal car accident. We are dissecting the anatomy of a cover-up, an intricate procedure of damage control, political maneuvering, and legal obfuscation designed to protect a man and a myth, at the cost. To understand the seismic impact of July 18th, one must first appreciate the precarious position of Ted Kennedy in the summer of 1969. He was the last son of Camelot. After the assassination of his brother John in 1963 and his brother Robert in 1968, the dynastic hopes of the Democratic Party, and indeed a vast swath of the country, rested squarely on his shoulders. He had been elected Senate Majority Whip just 7 months earlier, a testament to his political skill and the power of his name. Yet, this public mantle of responsibility was often at odds with a private reputation for recklessness. Rumors of womanizing and heavy drinking followed him. He was the kid brother, indulged and protected, now thrust into the role of patriarch. This internal conflict between the solemn duty he bore and the private behavior he enjoyed was a constant tension, compounding his personal stress at that very moment. His wife, Joan, was at home in Hyannisport, suffering through a difficult and delicate pregnancy, having already endured. She was not on the island with him. The other central figure, Mary Jo Kopechne, deserves to be understood as more than just a passenger. She was not merely a secretary. She was a respected political professional from a devout Catholic working-class family in Pennsylvania. After graduating with a business degree, she moved to Washington, D.C., drawn by the magnetic call of President Kennedy's New Frontier. She worked for Senator George Smathers before joining Robert Kennedy's Senate staff. It was here she found her calling. She, along with 5 other women, Rosemary Keogh, Esther Newberg, Nance and Mary Ellen Lyons, and Susan Tannenbaum, formed the core of RFK's campaign brain trust. They were the Boiler Room Girls, a name that belied their sophisticated operation. They were experts in delegate counts, political intelligence, and organizing. They were the engine room of the campaign, and they were fiercely loyal to its cause and its leader. Robert Kennedy's murder in Los Angeles wasn't just a political blow. It was a deeply personal trauma that left them adrift and disillusioned. The gathering on Chappaquiddick was conceived as a therapeutic reunion. Joe Gargan, Ted Kennedy's cousin and a man who often played the role of family fixer, rented the Lawrence Cottage for the weekend of the Edgartown Yacht Club regatta. The cookout on Friday night was a thank you to the Boiler Room Girls for their tireless work. It was supposed to be a private, casual affair, a chance to reconnect and share memories away from the pressures of Washington. The setting itself was part of the appeal. Chappaquiddick in 1969 was a place out of time. To get there, you had to take the On Time, a 3-car cable ferry that ran on a loose schedule between Edgartown on Martha's Vineyard and the island. The ferry's last run was at midnight. After that, unless you had a private boat, you were cut off. The island was a patchwork of dirt roads, modest summer cottages, and vast tracts of conservation land. It was a place where powerful people could go to be anonymous, to let their guard down. The isolation that made it a perfect spot for a private party also made it a perfect spot for a secret to be kept. The cookout at the Lawrence Cottage began in the late afternoon. Steaks were grilled, drinks were poured. By all accounts from the attendees who would later testify, the mood was light, even festive. Kennedy, who had competed in the regatta that afternoon, arrived around 7 p.m. He was seen drinking rum and coke. Other guests were drinking beer and vodka. The extent of the drinking would become a major point of contention, with all witnesses later testifying under oath that no one, including Kennedy, was drunk. Sometime after 11 p.m., Kennedy spoke with his chauffeur, Jack Crimmins, who was waiting for him back at the ferry slip, telling him he'd find his own way back. Then, around 11:15 p.m., according to Kennedy's own timeline, he and Mary Jo Kopechne left the party. This moment is the first critical juncture where the official narrative unravels under scrutiny. Kennedy's stated reason was that Mary Jo was feeling unwell and tired, and as she was staying at a different hotel from the other women, she wanted to be taken to the ferry to return to Edgartown. He claimed he offered to drive her. This sounds plausible on its face, but it is contradicted by several key facts that emerged later. Firstly, no other partygoer recalled Mary Jo appearing ill or tired. Secondly, and most damningly, she did not take her purse or her hotel room key with her when she left the cottage. It's an almost unthinkable oversight for a woman intending to go back to her hotel for the night. It suggests a different kind of trip was planned. Perhaps a short drive, a walk on the beach, but not a final departure. Furthermore, she did not announce her departure to her friends, the other boiler room girls, with whom she was exceptionally close. Kennedy got behind the wheel of his mother's black 1967 Oldsmobile Delmont 88. He had used the car all day and was familiar with its handling. The route from the Lawrence cottage to the Chappaquiddick ferry slip was straightforward. It required following the main paved road, Chappaquiddick Road, for about 2.5 miles. At a key intersection, a driver needed to bear left to stay on the paved road leading to the ferry. A sharp right turn, however, would lead you onto the unpaved washboard surface of Dyke Road. Kennedy claimed he made this turn by mistake. This claim is difficult to believe for anyone who has seen the intersection. Chappaquiddick Road is paved, smooth, and clearly the primary route. Dyke Road is a narrow, bumpy dirt and sand track that immediately signals it leads somewhere else entirely. It leads, after about a mile, to the Dyke Bridge and then dead ends at a secluded beach. The bridge itself was a primitive structure, a narrow wooden span built at an awkward angle to the road, with no guardrails. To cross it safely, a driver had to slow down significantly and consciously make the turn. It was not a bridge designed for speed or carelessness. Despite Kennedy's claims of being unfamiliar with the road, he had been driven over it earlier that day. Accident reconstruction experts who later analyzed the scene have argued that for the car to have vaulted off the bridge in the way that it did, clearing the bank and landing deep in the channel, it had to have been traveling at a speed far greater than the 20 miles per hour Kennedy claimed. Estimates range from 35 to 40 miles per hour, a reckless speed for a dark, unpaved, unfamiliar road. For reasons never explained, Kennedy drove his large sedan at considerable speed down this dark road, failed to negotiate the turn onto the bridge, and plunged the vehicle into the 8-foot-deep waters of Pucha Pond. According to the statement Kennedy would eventually give to the police, the car flipped over and landed upside down in the tidal channel. He described a terrifying scene, being engulfed in water, choking, feeling the strong current pulling at him, and struggling in the darkness to find a way out. He eventually escaped, though he could never clearly explain how. He then said he made between 7 and 8 attempts to dive back down to rescue Kopechne. He described the water as black and murky, the current swift, and his efforts as utterly futile. Exhausted, suffering from what he would later claim was a concussion, and in a state of shock, he rested on the bank for about 15 minutes before staggering back the 1-mile distance to the Lawrence cottage. What happened next is the heart of the matter, the beginning of the 10-hour silence that defines the Chappaquiddick incident. Kennedy did not burst into the cottage shouting for help. He didn't alert the 5 other women that their friend was trapped in a submerged car. He didn't ask anyone to call the police or an ambulance. Instead, he crept past a window, trying not to be seen. He found his cousin Joe Gargan and his friend, Paul Markham, a former U.S. attorney, and quietly summoned them outside. He told them, "There's been an accident. Mary Jo is in the car. It's in the water." The accounts of what followed, drawn from Gargan's and Markham's sworn testimony at the inquest, paint a damning picture of Kennedy's state of mind. The 3 men immediately got into a rented Valiant and raced back to the Dyke Bridge. Gargan and Markham, both described as stronger swimmers than Kennedy, stripped down and dove into the cold, dark water. They tried for nearly 45 minutes, diving repeatedly until they were exhausted and hypothermic to get into the car and find Mary Jo. They failed. The current was too strong, the visibility was zero, and they couldn't pry open the doors against the immense water pressure. Defeated, they returned to the bank. It was now well after midnight. Joe Gargan testified that he and Markham forcefully and repeatedly told Kennedy that this had to be reported to the authorities immediately. It was a moral and legal imperative. Gargan, looking at his cousin, saw a man not just in shock, but a man calculating the consequences. According to Gargan's explosive inquest testimony, Kennedy's primary concern seemed to be the political fallout. He was talking about how the accident would affect his career, how it would be tied to his brother's assassinations, and the Kennedy curse. Then, Kennedy proposed a horrifying solution. He looked at his cousin and his friend, and said he was going to say Mary Jo had been driving the car. He wanted them to tell everyone that she had taken his car and driven off the bridge alone. Gargan was appalled. He told his cousin that was insane, that there were witnesses at the party who knew he had left with her. The suggestion was not just a lie, but a cowardly attempt to place blame on the victim. Realizing that plan was unworkable, Kennedy fell back into a state of indecision. But he was firm on one point. He would not report the accident from Chappaquiddick. He insisted he needed to be in Edgartown. Gargan testified. He told him, "Look, Ted, I don't care what you want to do, where you want to go, we've got to report this." Kennedy, however, was adamant. He was going to handle it. He told Gargan and Markham to return to the cottage, act as if nothing was wrong, and not to tell the other women what had happened. He would go back to Edgartown and make the necessary calls from there. But the last ferry had run hours ago. So, at approximately 2 a.m, Senator Ted Kennedy, a man who claimed to be suffering from a head injury, shock and exhaustion, dove into the 500-foot-wide channel separating Chappaquiddick from Edgartown and began to swim. The current in this channel is notoriously treacherous, a serious challenge for a sober, uninjured swimmer in broad daylight. Kennedy, in the dead of night, made it across. He climbed out on the Edgartown side, walked to his hotel, the Shiretown Inn, and went up to his room. At 2:25 a.m., he appeared on his balcony and spoke to the innkeeper, asking him the time and if he had a newspaper. He seemed calm and composed. He then returned to his room, changed his clothes, and allegedly went to sleep. He made no call to the police. He made no call for a rescue team. At 2:55 a.m., he even called the front desk to complain about a noisy party in a nearby room. While Kennedy slept, or at least rested, Mary Jo Kopechne was still in the car at the bottom of Pucha Pond. Back at the Lawrence cottage, Gargan and Markham did as they were instructed. They returned to the house, where the remaining guests were still awake. They said nothing of the accident, nothing of Mary Jo's fate. They tried to maintain a facade of normalcy, a conspiracy of silence born of loyalty, and a directive from the senator. The sun rose on Saturday, July 19th. Around 7:30 a.m., Gargan and Markham took the first ferry over to Edgartown and met Kennedy, who was having a casual chat with another regatta participant. Gargan was incredulous. He described Kennedy's demeanor as ambulatory, conversational, not in a state of shock. He asked Kennedy if he had reported the accident. The senator had not. A furious argument ensued. Gargan yelled at his cousin, telling him that this was now a case of manslaughter, that he had to face the consequences. It was only after this frantic, angry confrontation, nearly 9 hours after the crash, that Kennedy finally agreed to go to the police. But events had already overtaken him. Shortly before 9 a.m., a teenager and his father, fishing in Pucha Pond, saw the submerged wheels of the Oldsmobile. They notified a resident, who called the authorities. Edgartown Police Chief Dominic "Jim" Arena arrived at the scene. He was a 41-year-old career police officer, the head of a small-town force, suddenly confronted with the biggest case of his life. A tow truck was summoned, and so was John Farrar, the captain of the Edgartown Search and Rescue Division, and an experienced scuba diver. Farrar suited up and entered the water. He found the car upside down in the murky depths. When he managed to get a door open, he found the body of Mary Jo Kopechne. His description of the scene would become the most haunting and controversial element of the case. She wasn't in the front seat. Her body was in the back, pressed up against the floorboards of the overturned car, her head tilted back, her face pushed into the footwell. To Farrar, this posture was unmistakable evidence that she had not drowned instantly. She had positioned herself strategically to breathe from the last and highest pocket of air remaining in the vehicle. Based on his extensive experience with drownings and underwater recoveries, Farrar firmly believed she had remained alive for a significant period, at least 2 hours, and possibly as long as 4. He was convinced that a timely call, a swift response, would have saved her life. She died of asphyxiation by drowning, he would later state, but it was a slow death. As Farrar was making this grim discovery, Ted Kennedy, accompanied by Paul Markham, was walking into the Edgartown police station. He asked to speak with Chief Arena privately. Before Arena could tell him that the car and a body had already been found, Kennedy began to dictate a statement. It was a spare, carefully worded account. He identified himself as the driver, claimed he had made a wrong turn, and stated that somehow the car went off the dike bridge. He mentioned his concussion and his state of shock. He described his failed attempts to rescue his passenger. The statement was a masterpiece of omission. It made no mention of the party, no mention of Gargan and Markham's presence at the scene after the crash. And crucially, it made no attempt to explain the nearly 10-hour delay in reporting it. The investigation that followed was a catastrophic failure, a textbook example of a tiered system of justice. The influence of the Kennedy name descended on the island, and the normal procedures of a death investigation were immediately compromised. Chief Arena, overwhelmed and out of his depth, treated the senator with a deference that bordered on subservience. The most critical investigative lapse was the decision not to perform an autopsy. The associate medical examiner, Dr. Donald Mills, performed a cursory examination of Mary Jo's body on the bank of the pond. He saw some fluid from the nose and mouth, consistent with drowning, and no obvious signs of trauma. He declared the cause of death was accidental drowning. District Attorney Edmund Dinnis, whose jurisdiction the case fell under, concurred. There would be no autopsy. This decision was and remains legally and medically indefensible. In any case of an unattended, violent, or suspicious death, an autopsy is standard, mandatory procedure. It could have determined if there were other contributing factors to her death, like internal injuries. It could have tested for alcohol or other substances. It could have provided a definitive time of death, confirming or refuting Farrar's air pocket theory. But the Kennedy machine was already in motion. One of the senator's lawyers, Burke Marshall, had flown in and was advising the family. With remarkable speed, arrangements were made to have Mary Jo's body embalmed and flown back to Pennsylvania, effectively moving the primary piece of evidence out of the jurisdiction of Massachusetts authorities. The Kopechne family, devastated and likely manipulated by Kennedy's representatives, agreed to waive the procedure. Kennedy himself was never treated as a suspect. He was not subjected to rigorous questioning. No sobriety test was administered, which Kennedy's delay rendered moot anyway, but it was never even attempted. His clothes from the night of the crash were never collected as evidence. The other party guests were not immediately separated and questioned by police to get untainted, independent statements. Instead, they were allowed to consult with one another before giving coordinated statements. The investigation was, from the very beginning, compromised by the status of the man involved. Kennedy retreated to the family compound in Hyannisport, where a team of his family's most brilliant and loyal advisers assembled. Men like Robert McNamara, Ted Sorensen, and Sergeant Shriver huddled together, not to uncover the truth, but to manage the crisis. While the Kopechne family grieved, the Kennedy team strategized. On July 25th, exactly 1 week after the crash, Kennedy appeared in court. The entire legal proceeding lasted 7 minutes. He pleaded guilty to a single charge, leaving the scene of an accident after causing injury. The prosecutor recommended no jail time. Judge James Boyle complied, handing down the minimum possible sentence, 2 months in the county jail, and then promptly suspended it. He cited Kennedy's unblemished record and stated that incarceration would not serve the best interests of the Commonwealth. Kennedy's driver's license was revoked for a year, and with that, the criminal case against him was over. That same evening, Kennedy addressed the nation in a televised speech. It was a political masterstroke, a 13-minute monologue designed to salvage his career. He did not offer a detailed chronology. Instead, he spoke in broad emotional strokes. He admitted his failure to report the accident was indefensible, but he immediately offered a defense. A concussion, a jumble of emotions, fear and panic. Then came the pivot. He invoked the Kennedy curse. "I was overcome," he said, "by a jumble of emotions. Grief, fear, doubt, exhaustion, panic, confusion, and shock. And I remember thinking as I walked along that dark road, am I going to live? Am I going to be alive? And then I remember wondering, am I going to be the president? And I tell you, I was wondering whether some awful curse did actually hang over all the Kennedys. It was a breathtaking piece of rhetorical jujitsu, reframing him from a perpetrator of negligence to a victim of cosmic fate. He wasn't just a man who had made a series of selfish, fatal decisions. He was a tragic figure in a group. He concluded by placing his political future in the hands of the people of Massachusetts, asking for their prayers. The response was overwhelmingly positive. Telegrams of support poured in. The Kennedy mystique had, for the moment, prevailed. But many were not convinced. The speech papered over glaring inconsistencies. A concussion severe enough to make him irrational for 10 hours did not prevent a harrowing swim or a calm conversation with an innkeeper. The story simply didn't add up. District Attorney Edmund Dennis, perhaps feeling the heat of public criticism and sensing he had been played, began a belated attempt to salvage the investigation. He petitioned the courts in Pennsylvania to have Mary Jo Kopechne's body exhumed for an autopsy. The Kopechne family, however, opposed it, wishing for their daughter to rest in peace. The Pennsylvania courts sided with the family, and the exhumation was denied. The last chance for any forensic certainty was gone forever. The one remaining legal avenue was a formal inquest, a fact-finding hearing required by Massachusetts law. Judge James Boyle, the same judge who had given Kennedy the suspended sentence, presided. The inquest was held in secret in January 1970. For the first time, witnesses were questioned under oath, and the official story began to crumble. Kennedy's testimony was vague and contradictory. But the testimony from Joe Gargan and Paul Markham was devastating. They recounted Kennedy's immediate concern for his career, his shocking proposal to blame Mary Jo, and their desperate, failed attempts to convince him to go to the police. Their testimony established that Kennedy's failure to act was not the result of shock-induced paralysis, but a conscious, deliberate choice, made against the strenuous advice of his own cousin and lawyer. After hearing testimony from 27 witnesses, Judge Boyle issued his final report. It was a legal bombshell. He systematically dismantled Kennedy's entire story. He found that Kennedy's turn onto Dyke Road was intentional, not a mistake. He concluded that Kennedy and Kopechne did not intend to go to the ferry, but were headed for the secluded beach. He found that Kennedy's speed was likely excessive. He stated flatly that there was probable cause to believe that Edward M. Kennedy operated his motor vehicle negligently, and that such operation appears to have contributed to the death of Mary Jo Kopechne. In short, a judge, after reviewing all the evidence, concluded that Kennedy had lied under oath and was responsible for her death. This report should have triggered a new wave of legal action, but it didn't. A grand jury was convened to consider the findings, but District Attorney Dinnis presented no new evidence and called no key witnesses. The grand jury foreman later lamented that they were given no direction and felt legally constrained. They brought no indictment. The legal system, given a clear road map by Judge Boyle, once again chose to do nothing. The case against Ted Kennedy was officially and permanently closed. So what is the anatomy of this cover-up? It is a complex organism, a perfect storm of influence, incompetence, and calculated narrative control. First, there is the power of the dynasty. Kennedy was afforded a 10-hour head start, a period of grace no ordinary citizen would receive, allowing him to leave the scene, consult with advisors, and begin crafting his defense. Second is the systemic failure of the justice system. The lack of an autopsy, the deferential police questioning, the rushed and lenient sentencing, and the impotent grand jury all point to a system unwilling or unable to hold a powerful man accountable. Third is the deliberate construction of a public narrative. The curse speech was a brilliant act of misdirection, transforming a story of personal failure into one of mythological tragedy, appealing to the public's deep sympathy for the Kennedy family. Finally, there is the wall of silence and loyalty. The people around Kennedy closed ranks, controlling information and protecting their principle, ensuring that the only narrative that took hold in the critical first hours and days was the one Kennedy himself approved. The Chappaquiddick incident became the defining moment of Ted Kennedy's life. He would go on to have a long and remarkably productive career in the Senate, becoming known as the Lion of the Senate, a champion of liberal causes. But the presidency was forever out of reach. Chappaquiddick became a permanent asterisk by his name, a ghost that haunted his every ambition. For Mary Jo Kopechne, the tragedy was absolute. A vibrant, intelligent, and dedicated young woman with a promising future was dead. Worse, her memory was subsumed by the scandal. She became a political footnote, a trivia question. Her life and accomplishments erased by the narrative of the powerful man who had been driving the car. The cover-up wasn't just about obscuring the events of a single night. It was about the slow, systemic erasure of a victim. In dissecting the anatomy of this case, we find it is not a singular act but a process. It's a death by 1,000 qualifications, where deference, political calculation, and the power of a myth systematically dismantled the search for truth. The 10 hours of silence were not just an absence of sound. They were a crucible in which a story was forged, a story designed to protect a future, even if it meant burying the past. It was a period of darkness in which evidence was allowed to dissolve. Stories were carefully aligned, and a political legacy was painstakingly salvaged from the wreckage of a human life. In the end, the dark water of Pucha Pond held two things: the body of Mary Jo Kopechne, and a truth the world would never be allowed to fully know. This has been Anatomy of Crime, where the truth is never simple, but always worth seeking.